When the first tremors shook the city of New York, most people assumed it was just another minor earthquake. The city had experienced them before, after all. Few paid much attention to the hairline cracks that appeared in the sidewalks or the brief flickering of the lights. Life went on as normal. But deep beneath the city streets, something was stirring, something ancient and malevolent, roused from eons of slumber by the echoing vibrations. In the twisting labyrinth of tunnels and caverns that stretched for miles under the earth, a hideous army was gathering. Dr. Eliza Hoffman, a brilliant but reclusive geologist working at Columbia University, was one of the first to suspect that the tremors were more than they appeared. She had been studying seismic anomalies in the region for months, and the data she was seeing now didn't add up. The vibrations were too regular, too localized, almost as if they were being generated deliberately. Eliza tried to warn her colleagues, but few took her concerns seriously. After all, what could possibly be causing earthquakes deep underground? The idea was preposterous. Eliza grew increasingly frustrated as her pleas fell on deaf ears. She knew she needed proof, something tangible to show the world that a threat was lurking beneath their feet. She got her first real lead when a team of sewer workers stumbled across something strange in one of the city's main drainage tunnels. They described it as a pulsing, glowing mass clinging to the tunnel walls, unlike anything they had ever seen before. Eliza managed to secure a sample of the bizarre substance, and what she found when she analyzed it back in her lab chilled her to the bone. It was organic, but not like any life form known to science. It seemed to be a kind of fungal matter, but with a complex, cellular structure that hinted at a level of organization and purpose that should have been impossible. As Eliza delved deeper into her research, the tremors continued to grow in frequency and intensity. Cracks began to appear in buildings, and sinkholes started opening up in the streets. People began to take notice, but still the authorities refused to believe that anything out of the ordinary was happening. It wasn't until the first attack that the truth could no longer be denied. On a humid summer night, the ground suddenly heaved open in the middle of Times Square and a horde of nightmarish creatures poured out into the street. Chaos erupted as the monstrous beings, each the size of a car and covered in pulsing, fungal growths, tore through the crowds of terrified civilians. The police were quickly overwhelmed, their bullets ripping into the creatures' flesh but seeming to do little real damage. As the slaughter unfolded and the city descended into panic, Eliza watched the news feeds with a growing sense of horror and grim vindication. She had been right all along. The threat was real, and it was only the beginning. In the days that followed, more attacks were reported across the city and then around the world. From London to Tokyo, the creatures were emerging from the depths to wreak havoc on the surface. Humanity was under siege, and no corner of the globe was safe. World leaders scrambled to respond, but conventional militaries proved woefully unprepared to fight an enemy that could strike without warning from beneath the very ground they stood upon. Defeats and costly stalemates began to mount up as the invaders pressed their attack. As society began to crumble and governments toppled, Eliza found herself recruited into a hastily assembled task force of scientists and military experts charged with finding a way to fight back against the creatures. She was flown to a secret research facility deep in the Rocky Mountains, built to withstand any assault from below. There, cut off from the chaos engulfing the outside world, Eliza and her colleagues worked frantically to unravel the secrets of the creatures and their origins. They studied captured specimens, trying to find weaknesses to exploit. They pored over ancient texts and forgotten lore, searching for any scrap of knowledge that might aid their cause. But even as they made precious gains in understanding, the situation continued to deteriorate. Cities fell one by one, the last bastions of human resistance crumbling under the relentless onslaught from below. In the Warren, the secure facility that had become both humanity's last hope and Eliza's whole world, the grim reality could no longer be ignored. They were losing the war. And deep below, in the nightmarish tunnels that wormed their way through the earth, something even more terrifying was beginning to stir. The creatures were evolving, growing stronger and more cunning with each passing day. and behind them, an even greater threat was emerging from the Stygian depths. Eliza and her fellow survivors in the Warren were about to face the greatest challenge of their lives, a battle that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of the entire human race. The war beneath the world was about to enter a terrifying new phase, and time was running out for all of them. In the Warren, the grim work of survival and resistance continued. Dr. Eliza Hoffman, now the de facto leader of the facility's scientific efforts, worked around the clock alongside her fellow researchers. They studied the creature's biology, trying to find some weakness to exploit, and analyzed the strange fungal material that seemed to be the key to their abilities. But progress was slow, and the news from the outside world grew more dire with each passing day. The creatures, which had come to be known as tunnelers by the beleaguered remnants of humanity, were relentless in their assault. They seemed to possess a hive-like intelligence, coordinating their attacks with terrifying precision. Major Jack Thorn, the battle-hardened soldier who commanded the Warren's defenses, grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. He argued for more aggressive action, insisting that they needed to take the fight to the enemy before it was too late. Eliza pushed back, arguing that they needed to understand their foe before they could hope to defeat it, but even she had to admit that time was running out. The Warren's supplies were dwindling, and the constant attacks were taking a heavy toll on the defenders. It was during one of these arguments that the alarm sounded. The tunnelers had breached the facility's outer perimeter. Jack and his soldiers rushed to contain the incursion, while Eliza and her team scrambled to safeguard their research. In the chaos of the attack, Eliza made a startling discovery. One of the captured tunneler specimens, held in a reinforced containment cell, was displaying signs of rapid mutation. Its fungal growths pulsed with an eerie green light, and its form seemed to be shifting and changing before her very eyes. Eliza realized with a surge of dread that the creatures were adapting, evolving to overcome the humans' defenses. She raced to warn Jack, but it was too late. The mutated tunneler broke free from its cell, tearing through the facility's corridors like a juggernaut. In the desperate battle that followed, Eliza saw firsthand the terrifying new abilities the creature had developed. It moved with blinding speed, shrugging off bullets and energy blasts like they were nothing. It could phase through solid matter, emerging from walls and floors to strike without warning. Many brave soldiers fell in the creature's rampage, torn apart by its razor-sharp claws or consumed by the ravenous fungal growth that spread from its body. In the end, it was only through the sacrifice of Jack himself, who lured the beast into a collapsing tunnel and trapped it under tons of rubble, that the facility was saved. But the damage had been done. The Warren lay in ruins, many of its defenders dead or critically wounded, and Eliza knew that this was only the beginning. If the tunnelers could adapt and evolve so quickly, then all of their efforts so far had been for nothing. In the days that followed, as the survivors worked to fortify their position and tend to the wounded, Eliza delved deeper into her research. She was convinced that the key to stopping the tunnelers lay in understanding the fungal organism that seemed to control them. As she studied samples of the strange material under her microscope, Eliza made a startling realization. The fungus wasn't just a tool or a weapon of the tunnelers. It was a sentient being in its own right, an ancient intelligence that had been waiting patiently for its moment to strike. Eliza theorized that the recent earthquakes and seismic activities had awakened this dormant entity, which she came to call the Mycelium. It had lain sleeping beneath the earth for eons, its vast network of fungal tendrils and spores spreading through the planet's crust, waiting for the right conditions to arise. Now, roused to wakefulness by the vibrations of human activity, the Mycelium was asserting its dominance. The tunnelers were merely its pawns, disposable foot soldiers in a war for control of the planet itself. Armed with this terrifying knowledge, Eliza knew they needed a new strategy. They couldn't just fight the tunnelers. They had to find a way to target the Mycelium itself. Everything depended on unraveling the secrets of this monstrous global organism before it was too late. As the remnants of humanity clung to survival in scattered pockets of resistance, Eliza and her team raced against time itself. They scoured ancient texts and delved into forgotten knowledge, searching for any clue or hint that could lead them to a way to stop the Mycelium. They sent desperate messages to other surviving groups of scientists and researchers around the world, pooling their knowledge and resources. But even as they made progress in their understanding of the enemy, the situation continued to deteriorate. The Mycelium was spreading, extending its reach ever further with each passing day. Reports came in of strange, fungal growths appearing on the surface, pulsing and glowing with an eerie inner light. People who ventured too close to these growths would disappear, never to be seen again. The war for Earth had entered a terrifying new phase. It was no longer just a battle against the tunnelers, but a desperate fight for the very future of life on the planet. And deep beneath the warren, in her makeshift laboratory lit by flickering monitors and pulsing containment fields, Eliza Hoffman worked feverishly to unravel the greatest scientific mystery of her life, and humanity's last hope for salvation. In the weeks following the devastating attack on the warren, Eliza Hoffman and her team worked tirelessly to unravel the secrets of the Mycelium. They studied samples of the strange fungal growth, subjected it to every test and analysis they could conceive of, and combed through the surviving scientific literature for any scrap of relevant knowledge. But progress was maddeningly slow. The Mycelium defied conventional understanding, its biological and chemical properties unlike anything Eliza had ever encountered. It seemed to possess a kind of distributed intelligence, a hive mind spread out across its vast subterranean network. As the researchers struggled to make headway, the situation on the surface continued to deteriorate. The tunnelers, now revealed to be mere extensions of the Mycelium's will, pressed their attack with renewed ferocity. Cities fell, entire regions were overtaken by the pulsing, glowing fungal growths. Desperate for a breakthrough, Eliza made a daring proposal. They needed to study the Mycelium in its native environment, to understand how it functioned deep beneath the earth. She suggested mounting an expedition into the very heart of the enemy's domain, to gather samples and data that could prove crucial to their efforts. Many in the Warren's leadership opposed the plan, arguing that it was too risky. They had barely survived the last attack and could ill afford to lose any more of their dwindling resources. But Eliza was adamant. They were running out of time and options. This was their best, perhaps their only chance to turn the tide. In the end, Major Jack Thorn himself volunteered to lead the mission. Still recovering from his injuries sustained in the defense of the Warren, the grizzled soldier saw it as his duty to see the fight through to the end. He and Eliza had grown close in their time together, bonding over their shared losses and their determination to save what was left of humanity. As the expedition team prepared to depart, Eliza pulled Jack aside. In a moment of raw emotional honesty, she confessed her fears for him, for all of them. The odds they were up against seemed insurmountable, but Jack just smiled that crooked smile of his and promised her that he would come back, and that when he did, they would find a way to win this war. Eliza watched with a heavy heart as the team, laden with scientific equipment and armed to the teeth, descended into the deepest tunnel. This was the path the tunnelers had used in their attack, the breach that had never been fully sealed. It led down into the darkness, toward the very heart of the Mycelium's domain. As the days stretched into weeks with no word from the expedition, Eliza threw herself into her work with a renewed sense of urgency. Every waking moment was spent in her lab, poring over the data, testing new theories and hypotheses. She barely slept, fueled by a potent mix of fear, determination, and, if she was honest with herself, an ever-growing need for vengeance against the entity that had taken so much from her. It was during one of these long, late-night sessions that the breakthrough finally came. As she studied a particularly unusual sample of Mycelium under her microscope, Eliza noticed something strange. The fungal cells seemed to be communicating with each other, exchanging complex chemical signals in a pattern that almost resembled language. With rising excitement, Eliza delved deeper. She cross-referenced her findings with the ancient texts and historical accounts they had managed to gather, looking for any hint or clue that might help her decipher this strange fungal tongue. And then, in a moment of stunning realization, it all clicked into place. The Mycelium wasn't just a mindless, invasive organism. It was an ancient, intelligent entity, one that had been communicating with itself, and perhaps with other forms of life, for eons. The key to stopping it, Eliza realized, might lie not in brute force or conventional weaponry, but in understanding its language, its very thought processes. Eliza worked feverishly to construct a translation matrix, a way to interpret and even mimic the Mycelium's chemical signals. If they could communicate with it, perhaps they could reason with it, or at least understand its goals and motivations. But even as she made progress, a new threat was emerging. Reports began to come in of strange, fungal-infected creatures appearing on the surface. They weren't tunnelers, but something new. Humans and animals that had been taken over by the Mycelium, transformed into monstrous shambling servants of its will. These fungal thralls, as they came to be known, added a terrifying new dimension to the war. They could infiltrate human strongholds, spread the Mycelium's influence like a plague. Nowhere was safe, no one could be trusted. As panic and paranoia gripped the remaining human enclaves, Eliza raced to complete her work. She knew that time was running out. The Mycelium was adapting, evolving at a terrifying rate. If they didn't find a way to stop it soon, there might be nothing left of humanity to save. And deep below the earth, Major Jack Thorn and his team ventured ever deeper into the fungal labyrinth, into the very heart of darkness. They had no way of knowing the horrors that awaited them, or the crucial role they would play in humanity's final stand against the Mycelium. The stage was set for a climactic confrontation, one that would determine the fate, not just of the human race, but of all life on Earth. And at the center of it all stood Eliza Hoffman, armed with nothing but her brilliant mind and an unshakable determination to see her species survive. In the depths of the Warren's research labs, Eliza Hoffman worked feverishly to refine her translation matrix. She was close, tantalizingly close, to cracking the code of the Mycelium's chemical language. If she could just establish a line of communication, perhaps she could find a way to negotiate, to find some kind of coexistence between the fungal entity and what remained of humanity. But even as she made progress, troubling reports continued to stream in from the surface. The fungal thralls were growing bolder, their attacks more coordinated and devastating. They seemed to be evolving, developing new and terrifying capabilities. Some could release clouds of toxic spores, while others could regenerate from even the most grievous wounds. Eliza knew that time was running out. The Mycelium was spreading unchecked, its influence reaching into every corner of the globe. If they didn't find a way to stop it soon, there might be nothing left to save. Just as despair began to set in, a glimmer of hope arrived in the form of a battered and bruised soldier stumbling into the Warren's main entrance. It was one of Major Jack Thorn's men, the sole survivor of the expedition into the fungal depths. Eliza rushed to the infirmary where the soldier was being treated, desperate for any news of Jack and his team. The man was in a bad way, his body ravaged by some unknown fungal infection. But even in his feverish state, he managed to relay a crucial piece of information. They had found the heart of the Mycelium, a vast subterranean chamber pulsing with an eerie green light. And at its center, connected to the fungal network by a web of pulsing tendrils, was a colossal, throbbing mass, the Mycelium's central intelligence, the nexus of its hive mind. The soldier described how Jack had ordered the team to set explosives to try to destroy the heart and cripple the Mycelium, but something had gone wrong. The creature had sensed their presence, had lashed out with terrifying speed and ferocity. Jack had ordered his men to retreat, to bring the intelligence back to the Warren at all costs. Eliza listened to the soldier's account with growing horror and a sinking feeling of certainty. Jack was still down there in the heart of the enemy's stronghold. Alive or dead, she couldn't say, but she knew with a bone-deep conviction that the key to ending this war lay in that subterranean chamber. Armed with this new knowledge and a grim sense of resolve, Eliza threw herself back into her work. She barely slept, barely ate, every waking moment consumed by the desperate race against time. And finally, after countless false starts and failures, she had it, a way to communicate with the Mycelium, to speak to it in its own chemical tongue. Eliza wasted no time in putting her plan into action. With a small team of volunteers, including the wounded soldier from Jack's expedition, she set out for the nearest known mycelium growth. It was a massive, pulsing mound of fungal matter that had engulfed an entire city block, its tendrils burrowing deep into the earth. As they approached the growth, clad in protective gear and armed with Eliza's translation device, a sense of oppressive dread seemed to fill the air. The fungus sensed their presence, its tendrils twitching and coiling like agitated serpents. Eliza stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She activated the device, sending out a complex series of chemical signals that she prayed would be interpreted as a message of peace, an invitation to parley. For a long, terrifying moment, nothing happened. The fungal growth loomed over them, silent and inscrutable. Then, with a shuddering pulse that seemed to shake the very earth, it responded. A wave of chemical signals washed over Eliza, complex and alien but understandable thanks to her translation matrix. And as she parsed the mycelium's response, her blood ran cold. It had no interest in peace, no concept of coexistence. It saw humanity as nothing more than a resource to be consumed, a source of biomass to fuel its endless growth. The mycelium was a predator, ancient and insatiable, and the earth was its hunting ground. Eliza tried to reason with it, to find some common ground. She spoke of the wonders of human culture, the beauty of art and music, the marvels of science and technology, but the mycelium was unmoved. Such things meant nothing to a being that measured existence only in terms of consumption and expansion. In a final, desperate plea, Eliza warned the Mycelium of the destructive potential of human weaponry. She told it of the nuclear arsenals, the biological and chemical agents, the devastating power that humanity could unleash if pushed to the brink. The Mycelium's response was chilling in its simplicity. Let them come, we will endure, we always have. With a heavy heart, Eliza and her team retreated from the fungal growth. She had hoped for a diplomatic solution, a way to end this war without further bloodshed, but now she understood the true nature of the enemy they faced. The mycelium would not stop, could not be reasoned with. It would continue to spread, to consume, until there was nothing left. As they made their way back to the warren, Eliza's mind raced with the implications of what she had learned. The mycelium's central intelligence was the key. If they could destroy it, perhaps they could cripple the fungal network, give humanity a fighting chance. But to do that, they would need to mount an assault on the very heart of the mycelium's domain. They would need to venture into the depths, to face the horrors that lurked there. It was a suicide mission, a desperate gamble with the highest possible stakes. Eliza thought of Jack, of the sacrifice he had made, of the countless others who had given their lives in this war. She thought of the world that once was, of the future that hung in the balance. And as she looked around at the haggard, determined faces of her fellow survivors, she made a silent vow. They would see this through, no matter the cost. They would take the fight to the heart of the enemy, would risk everything for one final chance at victory. The fate of the earth, of all life on the planet, rested on their shoulders, and Eliza Hoffman would not let them fail. The preparation for the final mission was a somber affair. Eliza and the surviving leadership of the Warren pored over maps and diagrams, plotted strategies and contingencies. They all knew the odds they faced, the likely price of failure, but they also knew they had no choice. This was humanity's last stand, their only hope of stopping the mycelium before it consumed everything. Eliza insisted on leading the mission herself. She was the one who had made contact with the mycelium, who understood its nature best. And deep down, she knew she couldn't ask others to risk their lives on a mission she herself was unwilling to undertake. The team was small, handpicked for their skills and their resolve. They were the best of what remained, soldiers and scientists, united in their determination to see this through to the end. On the eve of their departure, as the Warren settled into an uneasy silence, Eliza found herself alone in her quarters, staring at a faded photograph. It was a picture of her and Jack, taken in what felt like another lifetime, before the war, before the world had fallen apart. They were smiling, their eyes bright with the promise of a future now lost. Eliza traced a finger over Jack's face, a silent promise, a vow of vengeance for all that had been taken. Then, with a heavy sigh, she tucked the photo away and turned to face the long night ahead. The descent into the fungal depths was a journey into hell itself. The tunnels were dark and twisted, the air thick with the cloying scent of decay. Strange fungal growths pulsed and glowed in the darkness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The team moved forward cautiously, their weapons at the ready, their senses strained for any sign of threat. They all knew the dangers they faced, not just from the Mycelium itself, but from the creatures it had spawned, the tunnelers and the fungal thralls, monstrosities adapted for this subterranean realm. As they ventured deeper, the tunnels began to change. The rough stone gave way to pulsing fungal matter, the walls and floor becoming a single, living organism. The air grew thick and oppressive, filled with a miasma of alien spores that clogged their filters and stung their eyes. And then, without warning, they were ambushed. Fungal thralls, their bodies twisted and deformed by the Mycelium's influence, burst from the living walls. They came in a wave of tooth and claw, driven by a mindless, animal ferocity. The team fought back with controlled bursts of gunfire, with searing blasts from their flame units. But for every thrall they cut down, two more seemed to take its place, surging forward in an unrelenting tide of flesh and fungus. In the chaos of the melee, Eliza found herself separated from the others, driven back into a side tunnel by a pack of snarling thralls. She fought with a desperate fury, her rifle blazing, her heart pounding in her ears. But there were too many, their claws tearing at her suit, their weight bearing her down. Just as she thought all was lost, a familiar voice rang out over the din of battle. "Get down." Eliza threw herself to the ground just as a wall of flame roared over her, engulfing the thralls in a blistering inferno. She looked up, blinking through the smoke and haze, to see a figure emerging from the tunnel ahead. It was Jack, battered and bloodied, his suit torn and scorched, but alive. In his hands, he clutched a jury-rigged flamethrower, its nozzle still glowing cherry red. Eliza staggered to her feet, her heart in her throat. For a moment, they just stared at each other, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them. Then, with a nod of grim understanding, they turned back to the fight. Together, they carved a path through the remaining thralls, following the twisting tunnels ever deeper into the Mycelium's domain. The rest of the team caught up with them, their numbers thinned by the ferocity of the battle, but their resolve unbroken. Finally, they emerged into a vast subterranean chamber, the heart of the Mycelium's lair. The sight that greeted them was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. A colossal mass of pulsing fungal matter dominated the center of the chamber, its surface a writhing tapestry of glowing tendrils and throbbing veins. This was the Mycelium's central intelligence, the nexus of its vast network. Eliza and her team wasted no time. They fanned out around the chamber, planting explosive charges at key structural points. They worked with focused efficiency, driven by the knowledge that every second counted, that the fate of the world rested on their actions here and now. But the Mycelium was not defenseless. As they laid their charges, the chamber began to quake and shudder, the fungal matter rippling like a disturbed pond. Thralls and tunnelers began to pour from hidden crevices, a last line of defense marshaled to protect the heart. The team fought with the fury of the desperate, holding the line as the charges were set. Jack was a whirlwind of fire and steel, his flamethrower cutting swaths through the enemy ranks. Eliza wielded her rifle with deadly precision, each shot a defiant declaration of humanity's refusal to go quietly into the night. And then, with a final, resounding click, the last charge was set. Eliza locked eyes with Jack across the chamber, a moment of silent understanding passing between them. This was it, the end, one way or another. They turned to run, to make their desperate escape before the timer reached zero. But as they did, a tendril of fungal matter lashed out from the central mass, wrapped itself around Jack's leg. He stumbled, fell, his flamethrower clattering from his grip. Eliza skidded to a halt, her heart in her throat. She started back toward him, heedless of the ticking clock, of the certain death that awaited. But Jack looked up at her, his eyes clear and calm amidst the chaos. "Go," he said, his voice steady. "Finish the mission." Eliza hesitated, torn between her duty and her heart. But in that moment, she understood. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Then she turned and ran, every step in agony, every breath a sobbing gasp. She burst from the tunnel just as the charges detonated. The ground heaved beneath her feet, throwing her to her knees. Behind her, the tunnel entrance collapsed in a roar of falling rock and earth, sealing the fate of the brave souls within. For a long moment, Eliza knelt there in the dust and rubble, her body shaking with grief and exhaustion. Then, slowly, she staggered to her feet. The war was over. The Mycelium was destroyed, its hold over the earth broken at last. But the cost had been high, almost too high to bear. In the days and weeks that followed, as the remnants of humanity emerged from their bunkers and strongholds to rebuild, Eliza would be hailed as a hero, the savior of the world. But she took no joy in the accolades, no comfort in the praise. For her, the victory was hollow. The future she had fought for now seemed empty without those she had lost along the way, without Jack. But as she looked out over the scarred and battered landscape, at the first tentative signs of life returning to a wounded earth, Eliza felt a flicker of something else. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the grim satisfaction of a job well done, a mission completed. The world would recover as it always had, humanity would rebuild, would learn from this near apocalypse, and though the scars would linger, though the memories would never fade, life would go on. Eliza turned her face to the sky, felt the warmth of the sun on her skin, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a small, tentative smile. The war was over, a new day had begun.